for having me. Can you all hear me okay like this? Yes? Good. Okay. I might get louder as I go into a specific type of creaky voice, which I'll define in a bit. But so far I think it's okay. I'm going to be talking to you today about what I call creaky voice. You may have heard of it in the press as vocal fry, but I'll show you later that vocal fry, at least the way it's been traditionally defined, is a specific subtype of creaky voice. So what is creaky voice? It's a specific type of voice quality or group of voice qualities. Now by voice quality I mean a type of vocal fold vibration. So your vocal folds or chords vibrate, that's how they produce most sounds of the world's languages, but the way in which they vibrate can vary from a creaky quality to one's normal quality to a more breathy quality like this. There's a range of qualities that the vocal folds can vibrate at or with. And creaky voice is a voice quality group where the vocal folds at least typically vibrate slowly, producing a low pitch, and they vibrate irregularly, which produces an irregular pitch. At the bottom of this slide here, there's what we call a waveform. So this is a representation of the sound's pressure modulations over time. So here, each pressure modulation we call a glottal pulse. And as the speaker is talking, so this is time here on the x-axis, the larger the oscillations, the louder the voice, the closer the oscillations are to one another, the higher the pitch. What you can see at the end of this sequence is that the oscillations become further and further apart. So that's somewhere around this point here, each individual pulse becomes farther and farther away from the next one. So these pulses are very close together, but then starting at around this point, the distance between each pulse, the time it takes to complete a cycle, becomes much larger. This is the lowering of the pitch. And this is the end of a sentence. I'll play it for you in a moment, which means that the end of the sentence is often, a declarative sentence at least, is often accompanied by a lower pitch. But what you can also see is that the distance between each pressure modulation, each pulse, becomes irregular. So the irregularity, I put an arrow here to show in the middle of this sequence, the time it takes to go from one pressure modulation to another is greatly variable compared to at the beginning of the utterance, where the time it takes from one to complete one pressure modulation to another is really quite steady. So this sequence here sounds like the following. Let's see if this will actually play. No, of course. Let me try again.
Well, let me know.
Okay, let me make this a bit louder. And I wonder if you'll be able to hear this clearly.
Well, let me know.
Try it this way. Actually, that probably won't work at all. No, because the sound is coming from the program, was it, I think? Let me try now.
Well, let me know.
It might be the loudest it gets. So this speaker says, well, I mean it. I don't know if that's what you heard. It's obvious to me because I've heard this many times. This is from a corpus of spontaneous speech, the Buckeye corpus. I'll play it again for you.
Well, I mean it.
Okay, so at the end of the sentence, the speaker says, well, I mean it, with creaky voice. She's not saying, well, I mean it, with a T. That's going to be relevant later when I discuss how T is often accompanied by creaky voice. So at the end of this utterance, you get this irregular, low-pitched vocal fold vibration. That's the voice quality that I'm talking about as creaky voice. Okay? Now, creaky voice, crucially, is often found at the end of utterances, like the one I just played for you. But importantly, it can also be found over long stretches. So you can have whole sequences of words, whole utterances, that are spoken in a creaky-like quality. In this example here, this is another waveform. There are stretches throughout this person's speech where the oscillations, the glottal pulses, are irregularly spaced. And so really the speaker is producing a whole utterance that is generally creaky or irregular. So this sounds like the following.
And then there's like a sort of a whited out period there, so you get like...
Okay, I'll play that again for you.
And then there's like a sort of a whited out period there, so you get like...
So you might hear that the voice sounds low in pitch, It sounds irregular. It has kind of like a harsh quality to it. This speaker is producing a whole utterance, or in fact more than one utterance, more than one phrase with Creaky Voice. Now, Creaky Voice has been somewhat famous in the recent press. It's been defined as a new voice quality for young American women, though keep in mind that I just showed you a sample from a man. It might harm young women's career prospects, and it is a destructive speech pattern. So I'm not really going to talk about whether these are specifically true or false, but I want to show you that the Creaky Voice that I'm going to be talking about in this talk is actually very important in language, and it can be used specifically by speakers for linguistic purposes. All right, so the goals for today's talk are really to get at what is Creaky Voice and why do we use it. So I'm going to explain that Creaky Voice is actually not one thing, but it's in fact a cluster of different voice qualities, so different types of vocal fold vibrations that share some features in common. I'm going to show you that the different subtypes of Creaky Voice occur in specific linguistic environments, and I'm going to claim that Creaky Voice can be used deliberately by speakers to enhance certain sounds that occur in languages of the world. Okay, so what is Creaky Voice? Prototypically, as I mentioned earlier, it's a voice quality that has a lower pitch, which means that the vocal folds are vibrating more slowly than they otherwise would. It has irregular pitch, which means that when the vocal folds open and close, they do so at irregular intervals. And it's a voice quality with increased constriction, which means that when the vocal folds close, they close more tightly and then barely open when they're supposed to be opening over the course of their opening and closing cycle. So I'm going to show you a video of a speaker producing Creaky Voice. Can you see this in the back? Yeah, that's good? Okay. This is a laryngoscopic view of the vocal folds, which means that a scope was placed through the speaker's mouth with a camera looking down into the person's throat and videotaping the vocal folds as they open and close. So here at the top of the video, this is the this is the back of the throat here. In fact, the esophagus is right there. Here, this is the front of the throat, and this camera is looking down at the vocal folds. The vocal folds are these light gray structures over here. The black space between them, that's the glottis, the space between the vocal folds. So below the glottis is your trachea, your windpipe. And then there's additional structures which I'm not going to talk about because they're not immediately relevant. But crucially what you're going to see is that the vocal folds are going to be vibrating against one another. But when they vibrate, they're going to be vibrating slowly, though I've slowed down this video by a lot to show it to you. But they're vibrating slowly. When the vocal folds come together, they're going to kind of be very pressed against one another, such that when they open up again, it's going to look like the vocal folds are peeling apart because there's so much constriction that it's hard. It looks like it's hard to generate an opening. So let me play this for you. There's no sound, but the person, because he had a scope through his mouth, he couldn't really say much. So basically he was saying, Creaky Voice. And it kind of sounds like, because basically an sound is the only type of vowel that you can get that moves the tongue, which by the way, the tongue is over here, the epiglottis of the tongue. It moves the epiglottis out of the way so that you can see the vocal folds quite clearly. So it's not a very pleasant sounding video, but here's what the vocal folds look like when they're vibrating. So you can see that they open and close irregularly, so not at a regular timed interval. They open and close at different portions of the glottis, so sometimes in the back, sometimes in the front. And they stay closed for longer than they remain open. I'll play it again for you. So barely opening, and opening at irregular intervals. Almost done? No, still not. Okay, so that's Creaky Voice, at least prototypically. So it's vocal folds that are vibrating slowly, they're vibrating irregularly, and the vocal fold constriction is quite high, such that they remain closed for quite a long time over the course of their opening and closing cycles. We can compare this to normal voice quality, or modal voice. So this is the same speaker. Again, the same laryngoscopic view with the back of the throat at the top, and the front of the neck at the bottom of the video. I'm just going to play for you at the same time the creaky voice and normal, or what we call modal voice. So I'll try to do this quickly. So what you should be seeing is that on the right, which is the normal voice quality for the speaker, when the vocal folds open, they open much more widely. All right, so the glottis, the black space between the vocal folds, is much larger. There's more opening. You might also see that the vocal folds open and close more regularly in the speaker's modal voice. Another notable difference between the two is that the back of the vocal folds here remains shut during creaky voice, but in modal voice quality, there's always a space between the vocal folds in the back. That's the posterior gap of the vocal folds. That's not true for every speaker, but what that means is that this speaker's normal voice quality is somewhat breathy all the time. And I would know, because it's me, actually. So I'll play this again for you. So much wider opening in the speaker in my normal voice. So this would be, say, my normal voice, E versus creaky E. That's what I was doing. Okay? So again, creaky voice prototypically, when we think of it, is lower in pitch, it's irregular in pitch, and the vocal folds are more constricted when they're vibrating. But it's important to note that not all creaky voice is prototypical. So in recent work with colleagues Pat Keating and Jody Kryman at UCLA, we've identified 5 distinct subtypes of creaky voice based on their articulatory and acoustic characteristics. And the 5 subtypes of creaky voice can be classified according to 3 criteria: the presence of low pitch, the presence of irregular pitch, and constriction of the vocal folds, increased constriction, usually. So I'm going to now go through examples of creaky voice that differ along these dimensions, so the 5 different subtypes. Okay, so first there's prototypical creaky voice. I have just a little table here that goes through the 3 main criteria and specifies whether this type of creaky voice, the subtype, has these characteristics. So checks means it has the characteristic, X means it doesn't. So these now are synthesized stimuli, which means that I had a speaker, I recorded a speaker, I turned the speaker's voice into a synthetic copy, so I turned the speaker into a machine, and then played around with characteristics so that I knew that this voice had vocal fold constriction, had irregular pitch, and had a low pitch. Okay? But it's just a vowel, and it sounds like the following. It's a bit louder than I'd hoped. Or is it okay? Okay. So let me play this again for you. So it should sound somewhat like a machine. But I think you can tell that it's low in pitch. It sounds irregular, like the person's voice has a tremor to it. And the vocal fold constriction is hard to hear if you're not used to it. But basically what I did was I played around with the acoustic correlate of constriction to make sure that it sounded more constricted. I'll show you an example soon of a type of creaky voice that isn't constricted. Okay, now vocal fry, the way we define it, is not any type of creaky voice, but is a specific type of creaky voice that differs from prototypical creak in terms of the absence of irregularity. So basically this is a voice quality where the voice is low in pitch, but very regular. So the low pitch quality is actually quite regular over time, but still constricted. So this sounds like the following. Okay, which to me sounds more mechanical, probably because the pitch is so steady in this synthetic copy. I'll play for you the prototypical, then the fry, versus, okay? So this one sounds very mechanical. The pitch is so steady. I mean, I used a computer to make sure that the pitch was regular over time, but it's a little too regular. And I'll play some natural samples for you shortly too. Okay.
Mark, very quickly, so is it just because it's in the fry register frequency, that's why you call it the fry?
Yeah, so it's not just that the pitch is low and within a register that's typically called a fry, but it's the combination of the low pitch with the vocal fold constriction. Because you can be low in pitch but still unconstricted. Yeah. I think oh no, here I am. Okay, so vocal fry again is low in pitch but constricted. Again, sounds like this. I'm going to preemptively lower the volume. You'll see why in a moment. But tense voice is constricted, not irregular, so very regular in pitch, but crucially, it's very high in pitch. So when a speaker uses tense voice, really what they're doing is they're projecting their voice. So the vocal folds are very constricted when they're vibrating against one another, but the pitch is higher. So right now I'm using my tense voice. It's actually often called teacher's voice. So teachers use this when they project to a classroom. It's also sometimes called pressed in the literature. So this, again, it's a synthetic copy. It's going to sound unnatural, but it sounds like this. Okay, very high pitch. And this tends to sound very machine-like when synthesized. But I'll show you real examples shortly. I'll play it again for you. So you can imagine if you're yelling, that's the type of voice quality that you would be using. Okay. Going back to prototypical creaky voice, which again has all three major characteristics, what if we make the pitch of the voice so irregular that there really is no pitch to be had from the vocal folds? So this happens when the vocal folds are vibrating so irregularly that you can't actually get a recurring pattern. And the recurring pattern is what we call the vocal folds pitch, right? Their fundamental frequency. So you can still get a percept of pitch from other characteristics of the voice, but crucially you're not going to get it from the vocal folds. So let me show you how prototypical creaky voice differs from aperiodic voice. So it's irregular, but still you can get a clear pitch, a low pitch, compared to aperiodic voice. Okay, I'll play them again for you in sequence. Okay, it should sound very irregular. Harsh sounding, some people talk about it as being, because it's just so irregular that there really isn't a clear vocal fold, fundamental frequency or pitch from the vocal folds. Okay, now another very common type of creaky voice, but one that's really hard to synthesize, is what we call multiple pulsed voice. This is one that's not low in pitch because the vocal folds are vibrating at two different frequencies. So this could be due to many factors, one of which is when one of the vocal folds vibrates at one speed and the other one is vibrating at another speed. So really what you're getting in terms of a pitch is a pitch from one vocal fold versus the other. You're getting two pitches simultaneously. Another way you can generate this is through, say, throat singing, when the vocal folds are vibrating and the ventricular folds, which are just on top of them, or the false vocal folds, are vibrating at another frequency. Okay? I can't demonstrate this naturally. People ask me to all the time, and unfortunately I don't know how. I'm not that talented. But basically, this one isn't irregular in pitch in the sense that one pitch and the other pitch are happening predictably at the same, like when you expect them to be happening, but that in and of itself is irregular because normally you only have one pitch, not two or three. So here's prototypical creaky voice, and here's multiple pulsed voice. Okay, do you hear two pitches that aren't in a harmonic relationship, so they should sound like they don't belong together? It has almost like a machine gun kind of quality to it. Okay, I'll play you a natural example soon, and you won't get as much of that that machine gun percept, but it'll still sound very irregular. If you pay attention, you hear more than one pitch. Okay, lastly, there's the unconstricted creaky voice. Now this is important because at least even in the linguistic literature, when we talk about creaky voice, we always say there's more constriction, there's more constriction. The vocal folds are really tightly braced against one another. But that's not always true. So unconstricted voice is when the pitch is low, the pitch is irregular, but the vocal folds are actually spread, more spread than usual. So this sounds like the following. I'll play first prototypical versus unconstricted. So it should sound somewhat slacker like this. If I make my vocal folds more slack, you hear a breath going through my vocal tract, and that's present in this unconstricted creaky voice. So again, it should sound a bit slacker. So what's happening here is that the vocal folds are vibrating, but they're actually not coming together as often as you would expect for creaky voice. It sounds irregular. It looks, in the waveform, it looks irregular. But when you look at the vocal folds or the pressure modulations, you can tell that there's actually less vocal fold constriction than you would otherwise expect. Okay, so to summarize the different types of creaky voice, subtypes of creaky voice, I have the full chart here for you. And at the bottom, I've included natural samples that exhibit these vocal fold, these subtypes of creaky voice. So again, there's prototypical creaky voice, which shares the three characteristics that we want in creaky voice. Vocal fry is is not irregular in pitch, but it's low pitch, as opposed to tense voice, which is high in pitch and often very regular. Aperiodic voice has no clear vocal fold pitch. Multiple pulsed voice has more than one pitch. And unconstricted creaky voice, crucially, does not have the vocal fold constriction that we expect creaky voice to have. So here are examples of this from natural speech.
When he was talking to him today.
So in this sample, it's the word today that's creaky in the prototypical way.
When he was talking to him today.
Today. Okay. Vocal fry, low pitched and regular.
But it was.
So the speaker's saying, but it was.
But it was.
Okay. Tense voice.
Right now, I'm in the process.
So the right now that's pressed or tense.
Right now, I'm in the process.
Aperiodic voice.
Really necessary.
Really necessary. I'll play it again for you.
Really necessary.
Multiple pulsed voice.
Real and everything.
Okay. I'll play it again. Try to hear the two pitches that are present in the speaker's voice.
Real and everything.
I don't know if you can catch on. And then unconstricted creaky voice. So I know this sample is unconstricted because I had EGG, electroglottographic data, that showed that during the creaky portion, the vocal folds were actually spread more than usual. So this sounds like the following. It's just the word today, quickly.
Today.
You might even hear that it's breathy sounding, but it's also irregular.
Today. Today.
All right? It's actually quite hard to find natural samples of these, but I did the best job I could. All right, so the first take-home message for today's talk is that creaky voice is not one phenomenon. It's not one thing. It's actually multiple articulatory and acoustic things that crucially can't be reduced to a single feature, a single articulatory feature or acoustic feature. When we say that someone is creaky, we should really be asking, what kind of creaky are they? And when are they creaky? And why? I'm going to get to the why at the end of the talk. So, it's important, this difference, the fact that there's multiple subtypes of creaky voice is important because I'm going to claim that we use different subtypes of creaky voice in different environments. So we don't just lump them all together and say, oh, I'm going to be tense right now when I want to be creaky, but today I'm going to be aperiodic or multiple pulsed or what have you. We target specific types of creaky voice depending on the percept that we want to achieve and for specific reasons. So the rest of the talk is going to show that some creaky voice subtypes, at least, maybe not all, but some so far, are perceptually distinguishable one from the other. And that the specific subtypes occur in distinct linguistic environments, so in different positions. And that speakers can use the different subtypes of creaky voice to enhance or make more perceptually salient certain sounds. Okay. So moving on to the fact that creaky voice subtypes are perceptually distinct, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on American English. So in American English, the sound t, which I transcribe here in phonetic alphabet symbol as this, not very surprisingly, is often produced as what we call a glottal stop. So in a word like atlas, it's very rare for us American English speakers, or you American English speakers, but also Canadian English speakers, to say atlas. Atlas sounds very, very formal, bordering on stilted. Normally we will say something like atlas. Think you all share that intuition? Okay, good. Now, in phonetic terms, the way you transcribe this is, so this is the symbol for a, then there's a t if we produce it as atlas. But if we produce the t as a glottal stop, this is how we schematize it, with this question mark looking symbol without the dot below. Now the glottal stop, which we schematize with that symbol, is actually a type of creaky voice. So here is a waveform, again, pressure modulations over time, of a token of atlas. Between the a and the l and the I, li here, there's a portion right here where the vocal fold oscillations, the glottal pulses, become irregular. All right? So that irregularity itself means that this is a type of creaky voice, though a specific subtype. Okay? Now, it's important to note that if we produce a word like atlas with a glottal stop, and the glottal stop is a specific type of creaky voice, then a word like atlas with a glottal stop, here highlighted in red, is really only different from a word like Alice in terms of the presence or absence of creaky voice. or glottal stop type creaky voice. So you can even see in the phonetic transcriptions that I've provided that the word atlas and the word Alice share the same symbols, with the exception of Alice not having that glottal stop. So far, so good? Okay. Now, in addition to this type of creaky voice, this glottal stop creaky voice, another place where we often have creaky voice in English is at the ends of an utterance. So this is what I call phrase-final creak, what many linguists will call phrase-final creak. It's at the end of a phrase, the voice quality suddenly becomes irregular. So you can see in that box of the waveform there that the oscillations, the glottal pulses, are irregularly spaced one from the other. This sounds like the following. I think you've already heard this one.
When you was talking to him today.
So this is the prototypical creaky voice. It's irregular, it's low-pitched, and the vocal folds are constricted.
When you was talking to him today.
So the ends of utterances in American English are often creaky, for reasons which I'll explain later. Now, there's a question that comes up for me, it came up for me at least, which is, well, what if a word like atlas, which has its own type of creaky voice to replace the T, what if that word atlas were placed at the end of a sentence that has phrase-final creak, where a whole word can be creaky? So in that case, we're getting a percept of creakiness that could be due to two sources, two distinct linguistic sources. In the first case, it could be due to the glottal stop, the fact that the speaker said atlas and not atlas. And in the other case, it could be due to phrase-final creak, that the speaker ended the sentence with creaky voice, regardless of what the word was. It was atlas, but it could have just as well been another word. In this kind of context, where atlas occurs at the end of a sentence with phrase-final creak, do we mishear the word as Alice ever? So do we hear the glottal stop creak at the end of a sentence and say, you know what, I think actually that glottal stop creak is because of phrase-final creak, which means that this word is probably Alice, since Alice and atlas only differ by presence or absence of creaky voice. So here's an experiment for you. I'm going to play two samples. One is atlas, the other one is Alice, and we'll see how well we do. Okay. So these are both, and I should mention crucially, that these are both words that appear in phrase-final creak. So the whole word is creaky, but one has an additional source of creak, that's the atlas word, and the other one, Alice, is creaky over the whole word, but doesn't have glottal stop creakiness, because there was no T there.
Alice. 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 Alice.
Okay, so raise your hand if you think this one is atlas.
Alice.
Raise your hand if you think this one is atlas. Atlas. I see one hand. Okay, so you're correct. You're actually quite good at distinguishing the fact that this word here was atlas and this word here was Alice, even though both words were in phrase-final creak, okay? Like they would at the end of an utterance in typical American English. Okay, so this is actually what I tested in a study. So this is a 2015 study in Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, where I had 16 American English listeners listen to words that were either creaky over the whole word, like you would get at the end of a sentence, but they were, crucially, they had a pair. They came in pairs like Alice versus Atlas, or button versus bun, or dent, as in dent versus den. And the crucial conditions in this task were the following. So if the word had a T, like Atlas, so excluding words like Alice, if the word had a T, then was that T realized as a T, as in Atlas, or was it realized as a creaky glottal stop, as in Atlas? Okay, so Atlas versus Atlas. And then the next condition was, regardless of what the word was, a T word like Atlas, or a non-T word like Alice, whether that word was embedded at the end of a phrase with creak, so with phrase-final creak. So in a condition like, so I'm the speaker who produced the stimuli, let's say, though it wasn't me, but if I were to produce these stimuli, what I would do is I would produce a sentence like, Mark was the one who said the word Atlas. Mark was the one who said the word Alice. So you can see that at the end of that phrase, I'm creaking. And I'm creaking for reasons that are very predictable, it's, as I'll mention later. But crucially, the word Atlas or Alice appeared in phrase-final creak, or did not. So Mark was the one who said the word Atlas. That's not creaky at the end. Mark was the one who said the word Alice. Also not creaky, I think. Okay? So here's just a summary of the different conditions here. So on the, for the rows, you have whether the word that had a T had the T being produced as an atlas, or did not. Instead, it had the glottal stop creak as an atlas. And then the columns here indicate the other condition, which is whether there was phrase final creak or not. So if there's no phrase final creak, this is the phonetic transcription of the word atlas. You'll notice there's a T here in red. If that T was replaced with a glottal stop, as you would in more natural conversation, you get the glottal stop here, which is a form of creakiness, in the middle of the word only. Now, the important condition is when the glottal stop co-occurred with phrase final creak. Now here, we don't actually have a symbol for phrase final creak in the phonetic alphabet, unfortunately. So what I'm doing here is I'm embedding the whole word in brackets, enclosing it in brackets, and putting creaky at the beginning, to mean that the whole word was creaky because it was creaky at the end of a phrase. Okay? So this bottom right cell here is the crucial case. Do we hear this word as Alice? Okay, because we mistake the presence of the glottal stop for phrase final creak. Now, if the glottal stop is not misheard as phrase final creak, then we should be good at hearing that this word is atlas, really. But if we mistake glottal stop type creaky voice with phrase final creaky voice, then we might actually misperceive that word as the word in the cell in green as Alice. So here are the results for just a portion of the study. So here on the y-axis you have proportion correct. Because this was a two alternative forced choice task, I just marked chance at 50%. These are just atlas cases, not Alice, just atlas. And so here on the X you have whether the T was produced, so atlas, versus whether the glottal stop creaky voice was produced, as in atlas. Then the color bars indicate whether there was phrase final creak or not. So yellow bars indicate that there was no phrase final creak, and blue bars indicate that there was phrase final creak. And again, the crucial case is this last bar here, which has both glottal stop creaky voice and phrase final creak. Now, what you can see is that when the word atlas was produced in phrase final creak with a T, so Mark was the one who said the word atlas, atlas with a T. This case here, what you can see is that listeners are at ceiling. They never mistake this word for Alice. That shouldn't be that surprising, right? The person is saying atlas, atlas. But it's important to note that even when the whole sentence is creaky, listeners are good at this task. So creaky voice isn't intrinsically, doesn't make it hard to understand a speaker. Okay? Just because a person has phrase final creak does not mean that you can't perceive words. These participants are doing quite well. In the case where the word atlas was produced with the glottal stop, as in atlas, then suddenly we have an effect of phrase final creak, where speakers are doing slightly less well on this task. So in some cases, though very few cases, they mishear atlas with creaky voice throughout as Alice. But I should note that it's very few cases. So you can see here that their overall accuracy is well above chance, even above 80% correct. Okay? And this was the one of the hardest conditions of this experiment. So really listeners are good at distinguishing, as you were just earlier, are good at distinguishing atlas versus Alice, even though Alice and atlas could be creaky at the end of a phrase. So how do listeners do this? What are they using? Okay, so it's important to note that these atlas and Alice words were minimal pairs, what we call minimal pairs in linguistics, which means they really only differed by one sound, which in this case was a glottal stop creaky voice. So listeners are able to distinguish glottal stop creak from phrase final creak, and what I did was I looked at the stimuli and analyzed them for the acoustic qualities that I've defined creaky voice as having. And so in the case of phrase final creak, spoken by the speaker who produced the stimuli, there was low pitch, irregular pitch, and vocal fold constriction, which means that this speaker's phrase final creak was prototypical creaky voice. It had all three characteristics that we expect. But the glottal stop creak, crucially, was not prototypical. Why? Because the pitch wasn't lower than we would expect it to be if it were creaky voice. So basically, the glottal stop type creak was not prototypical. It did not have a very low pitch. So the second take-home message for today is that some creaky voice subtypes are perceptually distinguishable, and it really is an empirical question whether all subtypes of creaky voice are perceptually distinguishable. So far, there's some evidence that particular subtypes are perceptually distinguishable, but it's quite possible that all of them can be, at least in certain conditions. But I think what I've also shown you is that the different types of subtypes of creak occur in different environments. The glottal stop type creaky voice occurs as a variant of the sound T, whereas phrase final creak occurs at the end of an utterance, which is a specific linguistic environment that's distinct from a variant of T. So different linguistic environments, different subtypes of creaky voice. Okay, now moving on to the last part. The last part of the talk is, well, why do we use creaky voice? And to get to that answer, what I did was I looked at where do we see creaky voice? Okay, where does it occur in spontaneous speech, and can that tell us anything about why we use it in natural speech? So here's a little overview of where we use it in languages of the world, not just English. One very common place is at low pitch targets. So when we aim to have a low pitch. So in many languages that are tonal, the low tones of the language has creaky voice. So this is found in Hmong, it's found in Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Yoruba, the list goes on. When the pitch is low for a low tone, there's often creaky voice. Another very common environment that's similar is at low intonation targets. So what I mean by intonation is not lexical tones like you get in tone languages, but at the end of an utterance, say in English, for a declarative sentence, we aim for a low pitch target, right? We don't aim for a low pitch target, a high pitch target, because that would mean that we're asking a question or something else. Generally, though not always, we aim for a low target. That's an intonational target, not a lexical tone one. But at these low intonational targets over the course of a whole sentence, we also see creaky voice. In languages like English, that's the phrase final creak case. Serbo-Croatian, German, Mandarin, Italian, Chickasaw, Beningunwak, the list goes on. When you have a low intonational target, let's say at the end of a declarative, you often see creaky voice. Another environment where we see creaky voice, as I've alluded to in the perception experiment, is instead of T. So in the case that I showed you, the perception study I showed you earlier, the word atlas had creaky voice. Atlas. We don't say atlas in American English unless we're being really, really formal. Another case that's I think more interesting is a word like omelet, because we do pronounce the word omelet with a T at times. Like, I'm eating an omelet. That sounds normal, I think. But in a case like omelet and cheese, it's very unlikely that we'll say omelet and cheese. It does occur, but it's less likely. And this is an example excised from spontaneous speech where the speaker said omelet and cheese with creaky voice, which you can see here in the middle of the waveform. The pulses become irregular, and in fact there's a period of silence between them. This sounds like the following.
Omelet and cheese. Omelet and cheese.
Okay, so the speaker's not saying omelet and cheese. He's saying omelet and cheese. Again, with that glottal stop creaky voice. So one could ask, as I did, well, what does a low pitch target and a T in certain environments after a vowel have in common? On the surface, they don't really have much in common. One case we have a low pitch target, and in the other case we have a T that suddenly becomes creaky. But I'm going to claim that there's a specific reason that is shared by these two environments, these two linguistic environments, that can explain why we get creaky voice in both cases. In the case of the low pitch targets, well, it just so happens that creaky voice sounds low pitched, usually. Most subtypes of creaky voice sound low pitched, which means that if you produce a low tone with creaky voice, all else equal, it'll sound lower than a low tone that isn't creaky. So listeners hear most subtypes of creaky voice as being very low-pitched sounding. But what about this postvocalic T, meaning a T after a vowel, like at the end of a word? That's a bit of a mystery. So it's important to note that it's only some instances of these postvocalic Ts. So in a case of omelet, as I mentioned, I can produce this word as omelet with a T, and that'll sound normal, assuming I'm not stressing it as I just did now. All right, so again, omelet and cheese, this is with a glottal stop, though I just produced it without one.
Omelet and cheese.
Omelet and cheese, okay, just like atlas in this case. So why is the speaker producing omelet with a glottal stop here? So in a recent study with a grad student at UCSD in linguistics, we found that T, when it's optionally realized as a glottal stop, or as creaky voice associated with what we call a glottal stop, this happens more often when the T is followed by certain sounds, which we call in linguistics sonorants. Sonorants are sounds like nasals, M and N, sounds like L, R, and Y. Okay, these are the sonorous consonants of English. When the T is followed by a sonorant consonant, you're more likely to get creaky voice. Now, why? So it's important to note that sonorants have strong voicing. All right, but voicing means that the vocal folds are vibrating. So this is my simulation of vocal fold vibration. All right, they're vibrating pretty strongly. They're very voiced sounds. But it's important that T, as a sound, is voiceless. All right, if I say omelet, my vocal folds stop vibrating after the vowel, the in omelet, and they stop voicing, they stop vibrating, and usually they close. Sometimes they can open. So T is a voiceless sound. It has no vocal fold vibrations. But this is actually where T and D differ. So T is a voiceless sound, but D, duh, with heavy voicing, is a voiced sound. So that's here how we schematize D in the phonetic alphabet. Now, if you have a T, voiceless T, that's followed by a voiced sonorant, you're likely to get some voicing from the sonorant, say an N, bleeding into the T, okay? Which means that the T is going to start to sound like D, all right? If I say catnip with a T, catnip, it's likely that if I say it with a T often enough, it'll start sounding like cadnip, okay? Because that T becomes voiced. So if we produce the T with a glottal stop, as in catnip or atlas, then we're not losing that distinction between T and D. So what I'm claiming here is that just like low tones can be creaky because creakiness enhances the low pitch percept, creaky voice can be used with T to enhance the voiceless characteristic of it. So how is T with creakiness how does that sound less voiced or more voiceless? The idea here is that some subtypes of creaky voice, as I've mentioned, are constricted, which means that the vocal folds are braced closely together. If they're braced closely together, that basically prevents the T from undergoing voicing and making it sound like a D. When the vocal folds are tightly constricted, they can't vibrate, which means they can't become a D. The sound can't become a D. So in other words, low tones and postvocalic T have creaky voice for a very specific reason. The creaky voice enhances a contrast, and what that means is that the perceptual salience between the two sounds in a pair is enhanced. In the case of low pitch targets, what's enhanced is the low versus high, say, or low versus mid difference in a language that's tonal. And in the case of a postvocalic T, what you've enhanced is the distinction between a voiceless T and a voiced D. Now, this can actually account nicely for changes in languages of the world. So it's very common for a glottal stop as a segment, a sound of the language, to develop from T over time. So for example, in Scottish English, you won't hear what being produced with the T ever, at least not in normal spontaneous speech. Instead, what you'll hear is something that sounds like wo, or who, if you have the voiceless W. But crucially, you have the at the end, wo, not what. This developed over time, presumably because listeners, or speakers rather, produced the T with creaky voice, but eventually that creaky voice got reinterpreted as the defining feature of the sound, such that you no longer have the T closure anymore. You just have a glottal stop. This isn't just found in Scottish English, it's also found in many languages of the world, especially in East and Southeast Asia. The same is true for creaky voice with low tones. So now in Hmong, you have the low tone being creaky all the time. But historically, it's not analyzed as being creaky. It was just low in pitch. But presumably, the creakiness enhanced the low pitch, and eventually the creakiness became to be a defining feature of that tone in the language. So what's important about this is that the different subtypes of creaky voice can be used to enhance different sounds. So I've already alluded to this by showing you that the glottal stop creaky voice produced in my perception study by my phonetically trained speaker was different than the phrase final creak. But let's go back to the different subtypes of creaky voice here. We have the 6 different types. And we see that they all share some characteristics, but no 2 types are alike in every dimension, according to the low pitch, the irregular pitch, and the constriction. So the thing I want to allude to now is that in different linguistic environments, you're going to want to use different subtypes of creaky voice. For example, in the case of low tones, where the emphasis is to enhance, the goal is to enhance the low pitch, what you would want to use is something like vocal fry. Why? Because it's low in pitch, it's constricted, which means that the low pitch is ensured, but crucially it's regular, meaning it's not irregular sounding. You get a very clear, low percept. So that would be a good type of creaky voice to use with a low tone. But vocal fry would not be a good voice quality to use for every other purpose. For example, if I say the word atlas at a high pitch, atlas, then I wouldn't want to use vocal fry because vocal fry is low pitch, but I'm trying to sound higher. Let's say I'm talking at the beginning, like in the high part of my range, or I'm speaking right now with tense voice because I'm projecting. I wouldn't want to produce the glottal stop in atlas with a low pitch. So in that kind of context, I would want to use something like tense voice, where the pitch is still high, atlas, for example, but I want there to be vocal fold constriction so that the T does not undergo voicing because it's adjacent to an L, which is a sonorant. Another environment might be in questions. So if I said, is he reading the atlas? Atlas? And my pitch suddenly rises very dramatically, then a low pitch target might not be appropriate there because my pitch is rising. I need to convey that rise in pitch to indicate that I'm asking a question rather than a declarative. So in that kind of context, you might get a tense voice, which is high in pitch, but still constricted to enhance the T, the voicelessness of the T. So just to summarize, well, what is creak and why do we use it? I want to stress that creaky voice is not one thing, but a cluster of different voice qualities that share certain properties. They share low pitch and or irregular pitch and or increased vocal fold constriction. But crucially, there isn't a single acoustic or articulatory feature that all creaky voice subtypes have in common. All right, they all share some of the 3. So no single property is common to all creaky voice subtypes. Listeners can perceive these distinctions, so it's not like these differences are irrelevant. They are perceptually relevant. And importantly, they can be used in different linguistic contexts. So why do we use creaky voice? Now, I don't want to suggest that the only reason why we use it is to enhance certain sounds. There are, for example, many sociolinguistic reasons why we would want to use creaky voice, or subtypes of creaky voice. So to index some kind of social identity or affiliation. But there are phonetic reasons why we would want to use creaky voice. And I'm claiming that one of these phonetic reasons is to enhance certain sounds. Now, this enhancement can target different subtypes of creaky voice depending on the context. As I mentioned, for example, if you want to be low in your range versus high in your range, you don't want to use the same type of creaky voice. And that this enhancement can lead to pattern, systematic changes in languages of the world. So thank you. And I'd like to thank my collaborators who've worked on parts of this project. Christina Esposito at McAllister, Pat Keating and Jody Kryman at UCLA, and Scott Seyfarth at UC San Diego. Thank you very much.